Okay, so thesis 5. Remember, we're going through and looking at Kripke's critiques of the description theory of names. We looked at theses 1 through 4 earlier. Remember, he criticizes thesis 2, 3, and 4, but he thinks 1 is kind of trivial and uninteresting. Now we're on thesis 5 and 6 in this segment. So thesis 5 says, the statement, if X exists, then X has most of the properties at issue, is known a priori by the speaker. And here's a quote from Kripke. He says, notice that even in a case where 3 and 4 happen to be true, a typical speaker hardly knows a priori that they're true, as required by the theory. I think that my belief about Gödel is in fact correct. That is the belief that he invented the incompleteness theorem. And that the Schmidt story is just a fantasy. Remember the Gödel-Schmidt story we talked about last time. But the belief hardly constitutes a priori knowledge. His point here is he thinks it's true that Gödel is the person who proved the incompleteness theorem, and it's false that Schmidt did. But he doesn't think that the belief that Gödel discovered the incompleteness theorem is a priori. Now, recall why someone would think it was a priori. If being a competent user of the name requires having some description that fixes the reference be associated with the name, then it follows that any competent user of the name can identify that description. So let me put that again. If you think that sense fixes reference, you think that each name has a sense, then you think that anybody who is competent with the name can access the sense. Well, if you can access the sense in virtue of your competence, and the sense fixes the reference, then just in virtue of being a competent user of the name, you can associate a description with the name that will determine the reference. So if you're a competent user of Gödel, you can associate Gödel with being the discoverer of the incompleteness theorem. Well, your semantic competence guarantees that you can make that association, which means if you possess the term, then you have that knowledge, which means it's a priori knowledge. It's knowledge you can have just by reflecting on the meaning of your expression, independent of further perception. Now, what Kripke's pointing out is that consequence, that this is a priori knowledge, just seems wrong. It seems like for any description that I associate with someone, I should be able to be a competent user of the name without associating that description with the person, and so without associating it with the person a priori. Now comes thesis 6. The statement, if X exists, then X has most of the properties expressed as a necessary truth in the idiolect of the speaker. Well, Kripke thinks this is clearly false. Here's an example he gives. Green comes along and says, if Aristotle exists, then he did most of the following. He taught Alexander the Great, wrote Nicomachean Ethics, wrote De Anima, wrote Metaphysics, studied with Plato, founded the Lyceum, created formal logic, though not the sort we use today, lived in Greece, which is misspelled there, lived a long time ago, made significant contributions to several sciences, and so on and so forth. So if Aristotle exists, he must have done most of those things. And then what 6 implies is that in any possible world, whoever did most of those things is Aristotle. Well, say in some other possible world, my counterpart did most of those things. Does that mean our uses of the word Aristotle refer to my counterpart in that other possible world? So if I'm sitting here thinking about that other possible world, I can correctly describe it by saying, in that world, I'm Aristotle? Kripke doesn't think so. So Kripke thinks that someone of whom none of these things are true can be Aristotle. So suppose Aristotle had become a shepherd. If Aristotle had become a shepherd, none of these things would be true of him. Intuitively, it seems possible that Aristotle could have become a shepherd, and thus none of these things would have been true of him. But if thesis 6 is true, that's impossible. It's impossible for Aristotle to have become a shepherd if having become a shepherd means not having done most of these things, because thesis 6 says necessarily the individual has these properties that are associated a priori with the individual. And then in the example I gave of me being Aristotle in some world, that's the second part here. Kripke also thinks that even if all the things happen to be true of Aristotle in the actual world, someone of whom none of these things were true could have been Aristotle. Sorry, that's the shepherd example again. And the example I gave is another kind of example. Okay, so thesis 6 is false. How could someone of whom none of these things are true be Aristotle? Suppose the person who was named Aristotle at birth and who we've been calling Aristotle has all of these properties. That is, the actual Aristotle does satisfy these descriptions. Now imagine another world where that guy, the guy that we in this world call Aristotle, that very person, did none of these things. Instead, that guy became a plumber. And some other guy did those things. To whom does Aristotle refer in that world? Well, says Kripke, it refers to the same guy it refers to in our world, not whoever satisfies the descriptions. In that world, Aristotle was a plumber comes out true. Now, I think the simplest way to understand Kripke's point here is this. If thesis 6 is true, then claims like Einstein could have been killed before discovering the theory of relativity are false because it's necessary that Einstein did those things. Or Aristotle wrote Nicomachean Ethics is necessarily true, but it should come out false. And since it should come out false, but thesis 6 implies that it's true, thesis 6 must be false. Okay, so that's all we're going to say about the description theory of names. Just in quick summary, theses 2 through 6, Kripke thinks are all false for different but related reasons. I suggest looking through this segment, these segments on Kripke against the description theory of names a few times. The argumentation is subtle and complex. Kripke's writing here is very clear, so I suggest reading Kripke's writing carefully and looking through the segments a few times. Okay, in the next segment, we'll extend the discussion to the description theory of natural kind terms.